Dental photography is very important in our professional life, and I can bet you will agree with me. Everywhere we have digital processes, digital workflows, and as well the same is with digital dental photography. Because when we take the photo, we have to later on import this photo and we have to manage with these digital files. When you see these beautiful pictures in the books or sometimes on the excellent lectures, you wonder how they did it. What has to be done? Is it related to the camera or maybe some lens or maybe the light is important? There is a lot of elements, small details influencing the final result. What for we take dental photography? Because we know that it's very important and useful, especially in the case planning, but we need to record this so-called dental portfolio, initial status of the situation. So we need some records before we start any treatment. Based on this documentation, we can analyze the case, we can make some planning, and over the time we realized that we want to document the procedures, because when we document step by step what we did, even if we have some difficulties or failures, it will help us to become a better dentist. It's also very important type of communication in between our team and as well dental laboratory. You can't forget as well about marketing. When you have your own documentation, it's so easy to sell your services or to present the quality of your work.
Well, let's go on a journey back to the 18th century.
It begins with the human desire to capture reality. Drawing and painting were initially developed as a way to imitate and represent certain aspects of our surroundings. To assist in capturing this reality, they began with this, the camera obscura. This camera does not capture images per se, but rather manipulates them. The light that is reflected off an external structure, for example, a building, comes into a room or box with a small hole in the side. The light, due to optical inversion, is then reflected upside down inside the box, in complete detail and color. Here is a real-life example of a camera obscura. As you can see, a hole has been cut into the wall, and the images from the outside have been reflected onto the inside. Let's go back to the Burgundy section of France, the year 1826. Joseph Niepce, a French inventor, had been experimenting with light-sensitive materials for quite some time. He was incapable as an artist, so he used his knowledge of chemistry to develop a bitumen solution, which he coated on a pewter plate and exposed to 8 hours of sunlight, capturing the first photograph known to mankind. After his death in 1833, Niepce's understudy, Louis Daguerre, took this idea and geared it towards public use in the form of a daguerreotype. This invention became vastly popular, but, as with any piece of technology, it had its issues. For one, during capture, each person would have to sit completely still for many minutes, hence why people in these photographs tend to look unhappy. It was difficult to hold a grin for the duration of the exposure, so many opted for a neutral face that sometimes came off as angry. In the year 1900, Kodak released this, the Kodak Brownie. As you can see, this is basically a miniature version of the camera obscura, with a hole cut out here that has a lens put in it, rather than a pinhole. This allows a more concentrated amount of light to flow into the camera, thus allowing a shorter exposure time. Through the viewfinder on the side, you are able to see what you are taking an image of, though it is upside down, as it was with the camera obscura. In order to capture the image, light-sensitive film would be placed here. The consumers of this product would never develop the images themselves, hence the tagline, "You press the button, we do the rest." Over the years, cameras have drastically transformed, from box to film, Polaroid, DSLR, GoPro, and even smartphones.
So now let's talk about why this is called a DSLR, or digital single lens reflex camera. First of all, it's digital because it's a digital camera. We're not shooting on film. It's a single lens camera because we only have one lens on the front of this. There are other types of cameras that have multiple lenses. And then it's a reflex camera because the light enters through the front of the lens, it hits a mirror, bounces up into a prism, and allows me to look through the viewfinder. You'll notice the viewfinder does not go directly through the lens. The viewfinder is up above the lens. But because of this reflex, I'm actually able to look through the lens. So then you may be asking yourself, how am I able to take a picture through a lens while at the same time looking through that lens? And normally you wouldn't be able to, but the mirror actually gets out of the way each time you take a picture. So if I turn this camera on here and I take a shot, you can hear that ch-ch, and a few things are happening. First of all, the mirror is popping up. So if you look through the viewfinder, you'll notice that as you take the picture, it goes black and then comes back. That's because the mirror is popping up. The light then is coming directly through the lens and hitting what would be the sensor in the back, but there's a shutter in the way. The shutter has two separate leaves. So one opens up, revealing the sensor behind it. That begins the exposure and the camera starts to capture the image. And then one more leaf comes behind that, closing off the sensor so that it's not receiving any more light and the exposure is then over. Digital cameras have a digital chip, usually a CCD or a CMOS chip, that has photosensitive material on it that allows it to track red, blue, and green colors over the course of many different photo sites. The camera then takes all of this information, breaks it down, creates a file that's made up of millions of individual little pixels that are each its own separate color. So if you have a 10 megapixel camera, that means that the file that it's actually creating, if it's the JPEG or RAW file, it has 10 million pixels to create that image.
The different image sensors which are used in digital cameras and the modern day smartphones. Two types of imaging sensors which are quite commonly used in the imaging are CCD, which is the charge coupled device, and the CMOS, that is complementary metal oxide semiconductor. So both the type of sensor consist of millions of photosites or pixels. So these photosites converts the incoming light into the charge or electron. So although these two sensors are quite different, but they are common in many aspects. This sensor first of all convert the incoming light into the charge. So the photosites or the pixels are exposed to the light for a certain amount of time, and during this time the charge will get collected in these pixels. So once the charge is being collected by this pixel, this charge is transferred for the further processing, and after transfer this charge is converted into the voltage, and this voltage is being amplified using the amplifiers. So these are the common steps which you see in both the sensors, but depending upon the sensor the sequence might vary. So now let us first of all understand how this charge coupled device or CCD works. So as I said earlier, this CCD consists of millions of pixels. So as these pixels are exposed to the incoming light, these pixels will convert the incoming light into the charge, and the charge will get accumulated in these pixels. So once the charge is getting collected by these pixels, this charge is being transferred using this horizontal shift register, and this charge is being transferred into the vertical shift register. So in this shift register, one by one each charge is being converted into the voltage, and after the voltage conversion each voltage is being amplified using the amplifier. So once the vertical shift register gets emptied, the same procedure is followed for the remaining charge, and one by one each charge is getting converted into the voltage, and after that it is being amplified. So once the charge of each pixel is converted into the voltage and amplified, the output signal is being converted into the digital form using the analog to digital converter. So in this way, one by one the charge of each pixel is getting converted into the voltage, and the same procedure is repeated for the next frame. So this is the basic principle of the charge coupled device. Now let us similarly see how this CMOS sensor works. So in case of the CMOS sensor, the fabrication technology is very similar to the fabrication technology of the integrated circuits. So because of that, many peripheral circuits can be integrated inside the single chip. So in case of the CMOS sensor, the charge to voltage conversion as well as the voltage amplification is carried out in the pixel itself. And as the charge to voltage conversion and the amplification is carried out in the pixel itself, so the processing speed of the CMOS sensor will be much higher than the CCD sensors. So in case of the CMOS sensor, the voltage that is generated by each pixel is being read in a line by line fashion. So first of all, the first row of the pixel is being activated using this pixel select switch. So this pixel select switch connects this output voltage of this pixel to the column line. And by activating the column select switch one by one, we can read the data of each pixel, and the same procedure is repeated for the remaining lines. So in this way, in case of the CMOS sensor, the data is being read in a line by line fashion. So when we require the fast processing speed as well as the low power consumption. In such cases, the CMOS sensors are preferred over the CCD sensors. While in applications where you require the high dynamic range and the low amount of noise, like a space application, in such cases, the CCD sensors are preferred over this CMOS sensor.
As you probably know, light enters a camera through the lens. And as you probably know, most lenses have multiple glass elements which can focus the light and beam it on the film, or in this case, the camera sensor, which is located inside the body itself. Now, some lenses are zoom lenses, and if you turn the zoom ring, you're going to be moving certain elements backwards and forwards. That's going to change the magnification of what you're actually capturing on that sensor. Now, there's other elements as well, and of course, all lenses have a focus ring. Moving those around will determine what part of your scene is actually in focus. Do you want to focus on something that's really close to the camera, or do you want to focus on something that's really far away from the camera? In the middle of each of these lenses is an aperture. It has multiple blades, and it can either open up or stop down, allowing more light to enter or less light to enter. When the aperture is wide open, light is able to enter the lens and hit the sensor from multiple different angles. This creates a shallow depth of field. Your subject might be in focus, but the background will quickly go out of focus. If you stop down that aperture, creating a really, really small opening, now light is only able to enter the lens directly from the front from one direction, and therefore we get a deeper depth of field, meaning that your subject and the background can be more in focus.
A photograph is the delicate balance of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These are the camera settings that come together to emphasize an aesthetic, create a style, to make the image. Timing, depth of field, light sensitivity. All three are equally important. But in order to balance these camera settings, you must prioritize the exposure trinity in a way that best presents your subject. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to show each individual camera setting and the way that it affects an image. First up, shutter speed. Shutter speed is the measured time of an image, the moment between the opening and the closing of the camera shutter. We've got Jake here in a very windy environment. His hair is going everywhere. To freeze this motion, we need to use a very high or fast shutter speed. But if we want to emphasize motion blur of the hair, we'll want to do just the opposite. A low or slow shutter speed will give us the opposite effect. So, the higher or faster the shutter speed, the more likely you'll be able to freeze action. The lower or slower the shutter speed, the more likely you'll be to blur the motion. Next up, aperture. Aperture is the size of the hole that lets light into the camera. Here we have a very nice portrait setup for Jake. By changing our aperture, we're able to specify how much of our lovely subject stays in focus. Shooting at a larger aperture like f2.8, the smaller the number, the larger the hole, creates a very narrow area of focus. Stopping the aperture down to say f20, the larger the number, the smaller the hole, gives us greater depth of field with more of the subject and background in focus. The larger the f-stop, the more shallow the depth of field. The smaller the aperture, the more overall focus in the image. Third, ISO. ISO is the chosen light sensitivity of the film or sensor. It's Jake again, in a room with ample light. Shooting at a lower sensitivity, like ISO 200, should be fine here. Highlights and shadow detail are clean and virtually without noise. But when the lights go down, we'll need to raise the sensitivity to make an exposure. Employing a higher ISO allows us to make photographs in this challenging scene, but it also introduces noise to the image, particularly in the mid-tone and shadow areas. So choose lower ISOs in bright or well-lit scenarios, and choose higher ISOs in dark or poorly lit situations. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO, all three are equally important, but you can only start with one. If you want to make a photograph of something fast-moving, you want to freeze the action, you need to shoot with a higher shutter speed. Aperture and ISO, they'll follow. If you'd like to make a photograph with a shallow depth of field, open your aperture up. Shutter speed and ISO, they come later. If you're in a dark situation, raise your ISO up, then set the aperture and shutter speed.
Rule number 1. Light travels in straight lines. Now, a light source is going to send rays of light in all different directions, but each individual ray of light is on its own straight path. A ray of light will continue to travel on a straight path until it's deflected onto another straight path. Rule number 2. A subject receives less light as the light source is moved farther away. Now think about it this way. Light rays are coming out of the source at many different angles, and as they keep moving out, they're spreading farther and farther apart. An object close to the light source is going to receive a lot of those rays, but if that object is farther away, fewer rays are going to be on a direct path to strike it. That means less illumination. The inverse square law says that as the distance between the light source and the subject doubles, the amount of light reaching the subject is reduced by 75%. So double the distance and you'll get only a quarter of the original amount of light on your subject. Light continues to drop off rapidly with further increases in distance. Rule number 3. The larger the light source relative to your subject, the softer the light. Rays from a large light source simply have more access to areas around a three-dimensional object, like your subject's head. In this example, you can see how there is a direct path from areas on the front of the softbox to areas on the side of the subject. But why is there a decreasing amount of light as it makes its way around the subject? Well, rule number 2 says that we're going to get different intensities of light where there are varying distances from subject to the light source. And along with that, you can see that while the front areas of the subject are receiving light rays from the entire front panel of the light source, the side areas only receive partial lighting. So in effect, part of the light source is creating shadows on the subject, and part of it fills in those shadows. Put that all together, and you get a nice gradual light drop-off and a soft-looking light pattern. Other ways to create softer light include using reflectors, secondary light sources, and bounce techniques. And these can all be thought of as ways to create a larger light source relative to your subject. Okay, remember that rule number 3 states that the larger the light source relative to your subject, the softer the light. That means that the actual size of the light source isn't what's most important. It's the relative size, meaning how big the light source appears in comparison to the subject. A little flash unit is made into a larger light source when used in a softbox. And a softbox can be a large light source at a close distance to your subject, but it becomes a smaller source of light relative to your subject as it moves away. Smaller light sources relative to your subject produce more contrast and harder light because they don't have access to areas around the subject the same way they would if they were much closer to the subject.
As a dentist, every time when you will take the clinical shots, you will need artificial light, which comes from the flash. We have different types of the flashes. It can be single, it can be ring flash, it can be dual flash. Light and direction of this light will illuminate the scene, will illuminate the teeth or face. So it's important to understand how the light will affect the final result.
Macro lens. A macro lens is used for dental photography or really any kind of extreme close-up photography. And what makes them unique is that they're capable of reproducing an image on your sensor that's actually life-size. And each macro lens has a little window on it, as you see in the photograph at the bottom here, and it shows what's called the reproduction ratio. And when it's showing you a reproduction ratio of 1:1, that means that the image that you capture on your camera's sensor is actually being captured in life size, and it gets smaller from there. So that's what really makes a macro lens unique, and as I said, you don't just use it for dental photography, but for any kind of extreme close-up photography. So if we go back to that 60mm lens again, and we look at that field of view and we look at an image, you can see that I decide pretty wide, more than you might want in the image actually. But that's because we are a certain distance, camera distance, from the model, physically. So if you look at an 85 millimeter lens, same camera to subject distance, you're going to see that it looks like it's zoomed in because the 85 millimeter focal length is a longer focal length, and the field of view, as you see, becomes narrower. And if we go to a 105 millimeter focal length macro lens, we're really getting tight in there. So the field of view narrows dramatically from 60 millimeters to 105 millimeters.
Macro lens should be your primary choice, especially for dental photography. We have different types and brands of the lenses in macro photography as well. And you will have selection from Canon, Nikon, but also different companies like Sigma, Tamron or Tokina. With all these lenses, you will be able to get good results.